Okay, good evening and a very warm welcome to ACMI and our public seminar tonight. My name is Luci Pangrazio and I'm a Chief Investigator at the Deakin node of the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. Now, this is the sixth seminar that we've held at ACMI since 2022, and these seminars are an opportunity for us to collaborate with our other institutions and organisations about the work that's taking place in the centre and to connect with our wider community. So we would like to begin tonight with an acknowledgement of country.
Deakin University would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waterways on which our students and staff come together. As we learn, teach, innovate, and research through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country that you join us from. An ancient place where education, innovation, and knowledge transfer have taken place for many thousands of years. At Deakin, we aim to nurture and continue this important legacy whilst encouraging our communities to walk softly on country in the spirit of sustainability. In particular, we give gratitude to the elders and ancestors of Wadawurrung country, Wurundjeri country, and Eastern Maar country and beyond, where our physical campuses are located. Their contributions to our learning communities and environments are rich and highly valued. Deakin is committed to embedding Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in all disciplines that we teach, as well as advancing the self-determined interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including treaty and truth-telling. As you move around our physical and virtual environments, take a moment to consider, appreciate, and listen deeply to the country beneath your feet.
I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered here tonight, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their cultures, knowledges, and the elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the custodians of the lands and waterways across the country from where our participants online are joining us tonight. So welcome to everyone online. So we're here tonight to discuss how, or even whether, it is possible for schools to achieve informed consent regarding the digital technologies they use. By informed consent, we mean the process of communicating to parents and students in clear and understandable ways how their personal information is being used by the digital technologies in the school. Now, we decided on this topic after working in schools and childcare centres and realising how little support there is for educational institutions and educators to both know the data processing practices of third-party edtech products or education technology products and communicate these to the school community. So what we heard from our participants was a range of challenges and tensions and issues that make this very difficult terrain. Now, as we know, Australian schools are now bursting with digital technologies. Digital platforms are used to enrol students, deliver learning content, and communicate with parents. And there is increasing use of facial recognition technologies and other smart devices in classrooms. Now, this is indicative of the growing digitalisation of schools and society and has given rise to a booming multi-billion-dollar edtech industry. And this has become a largely unquestioned part of education across the world today. Yet, what are the implications of introducing these technologies into classrooms and asking students, teachers, and families to sign up to the platform? Now, this really hit our radar back in 2022 when the Human Rights Watch released a report that showed that children are surveilled at alarming rates in their online classrooms. So the Human Rights Watch report observed 145 edtech products directly sending or granting access to children's personal data to 196 third-party companies. Now, these were overwhelmingly advertising technology, or ad tech. Now, this data is used to build a profile of children so that they can be targeted with advertisements that follow them across the internet. But that really is just the tip of the iceberg. Some EdTech products today are designed to track and monitor students' online movements and provide ongoing reports to teachers in real time. Others are designed to log emotional states and track eye movements in an attempt to find correlates with learning outcomes, which can then be managed and optimised. Now, this can distort children's online experiences, but also risks influencing their opinions and beliefs at a time in their lives when they are quite vulnerable to manipulation and interference. Children have the right to digital privacy, which means respecting their personal information in online spaces. Now, this is recognised internationally in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and also the Australian Privacy Act. Now, we know not all EdTech companies are engaged in these problematic practices, and we have seen some really promising signs of change in recent years. For example, Safer Tech for Schools by Education Services Australia offers a standardised approach to evaluating digital products and services used by schools across Australia and New Zealand. In addition, EduGrowth, which is based here at Deakin, aims to promote and innovate the local EdTech industry, but from a foundation of transparent governance and compliance systems. Yet while the Australian EdTech industry might be improving, we know that schools are filled with tech made overseas, namely from the US. And we are currently seeing a huge expansion of big tech platforms such as Microsoft, Apple and Google into Australian schools. Now, these large, complex, multinational companies have opaque and clandestine data practices, which makes it very difficult for schools and departments of education to conduct data privacy assessments. Just yesterday, a report from The Guardian revealed that Microsoft was collecting the voice and facial data of students from the New South Wales Department of Education's Teams platform, and then they were feeding that into Copilot in order to improve the accuracy of their transcription services, that is, to improve their product. Now, this was quickly shut down, but we need to ask, what is the consequence of those children's data being collected? Where will it go, and what will come of that in the future? In schools that are hamstrung by tight budgets and limited back-end infrastructures, choices in digital procurement can become really limited. It can also be difficult for schools to offer students and families the opportunity to opt out from using these platforms, particularly those that have become really entrenched in daily practices and processes. And while schools might justify procuring EdTech in terms of lifting learning outcomes, students themselves do not always feel positive about EdTech. A study that we conducted a few years ago into how teenage students themselves experience digital platforms in their school revealed a real heightened anxiety about being tracked at home and at school. Some students felt that schools and teachers should trust them more instead of just remotely monitoring them through digital platforms that try to catch them out if they're being off task or misbehaving. So not only can these products jeopardise students' privacy, but it also appears that they can potentially erode interpersonal relationships with schools. At the end of the day, procuring EdTech for schools and early childcare centres is not an easy task. On the one hand, digital platforms in schools are integral to how they market themselves, not only in terms of tech innovation and the data-driven insights that they offer prospective students and families, but on the other hand, the more platforms a school procures, the greater the risk around data security and privacy. So it's not easy for schools to inform their community about the data practices of third parties, and there are a number of reasons for this. First, it can be difficult to get truthful answers from companies. For example, some EdTech companies stress that their online environments had adequate data privacy protections, yet the Human Rights Watch report found that the pages adjacent to the online classroom, such as the login page, the home page, and adjacent pages with children's content, did not. Furthermore, ad tech companies denied knowledge that this sensitive personal data that was being sent to them was actually their clients' responsibility. So they should just not be sending their children's data. What happens if parents do not... we also need to talk about, and we will be talking quite a bit about, the terms and conditions of these platforms. Terms and conditions are the main way in which data practices of the company are communicated to students and parents, and many of these are extremely long and use complicated language that is very difficult for non-specialists to use. What happens if parents do not consent to their children using a particular platform at schools for learning? Do schools have the resources to provide them with an alternative task or another digital platform? Without the ability to legitimately opt out from using products, we must ask, is this actually informed consent? Now, children have a right to privacy, digital privacy, but they also have a right to access education. So we need to make sure that one does not exclude the other. The question of how we balance these rights is brought into sharp relief when it comes to the procurement of EdTech in schools. Now, a final consideration for us is the changes promised by the Office of the Australian Information Commission, which is currently drafting the Children's Online Privacy Code. Now, this code is touted as putting children at the centre of privacy protections in Australia, and it will specify how online services that are accessed by children, and that includes EdTech, must comply with the Australian privacy principles. Yet the details of the code and how it will be used in relation to EdTech are yet to be determined. Informed consent in schools regarding digital technology is a complex issue with many competing tensions and issues for us to consider tonight, which is why I'm extremely lucky to have the panellists join us here to thrash out some of these issues. So I would like to now invite them to come to the stage. And tonight, first, we have Associate Professor Anna Bunn, who is the Dean of Learning and Teaching in the Faculty of Business and Law at Curtin University. Now, she works with educators and school students to increase understanding of legal rights and issues in relation to the use of technology. Coming from a legal background, but having researched children's issues and rights, Anna brings both a legal and a child's rights focus to the panel tonight. Mr. Duane Cox is the Chief Innovation Officer at EdTech company Schoolbox. Duane has a rich background in education, accumulating over a decade of experience as both an educator and a leader in EdTech. With an educational leadership background and an understanding of various educational technology platforms, Duane brings an EdTech industry perspective to our panel discussion tonight. Now, Ms. Koren Irving is a school leader at St Joseph's College in Geelong. She has held various leadership roles in e-learning and learning innovation and is passionate about leveraging technology to enhance learning experiences. With 20 years of experience in education across government, independent and Catholic sectors in Geelong and Melbourne, Koren brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise from schools to the panel discussion. And last but not least, Mr. Simon Elvery is a Brisbane-based journalist and developer at ABC News Story Lab. He's also a parent of 2 children. He's currently reporting on algorithms and their effects on our lives with a particular focus on algorithmic decision-making. Simon not only brings a parent perspective to the panel discussion tonight, but also the very sharp focus of an investigative journalist. Now, this panel discussion is simultaneously being recorded and presented via Zoom. So we will have questions that the online participants can pop in the chat for later on. But we're now going to move to a panel discussion, and I'll go and sit down. Okay, so the first question tonight is for Anna. Could you please tell us a little bit about the legal requirements around collecting and using personal information for purposes of EdTech? Is consent always required, and what do we mean by the term informed consent? And finally, what are the ways that informed consent might be achieved?
Thanks, Lucy. Yes, so is the sound okay? Yep. Yeah, great. So actually, informed consent, or consent isn't always actually required before personal information is collected and used, but it is required in some situations. So Australian privacy laws apply to large private organisations, so larger ed-tech companies and also probably most private schools. And the privacy laws also apply to government agencies, so government schools as well. And the privacy laws require organisations and agencies to take reasonable steps to tell people when their personal information is collected, and generally impose obligations to actually tell people what's happening, what kinds of information they collect and what happens to it. So consent's not always required, but it is in some situations. So consent is required when the information being collected is sensitive, personal information. So that's things like information about health, about ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, and that kind of thing. And consent's also needed if the organisation or agency is wanting to use someone's personal information for a purpose other than the one it was collected for, and that purpose isn't related to the original purpose, or the person wouldn't expect their information to be used for that purpose. So in these cases, legally, consent is required, and in order for that to be valid, the law requires that the consent be freely given and that it be informed. So what do we mean when we're talking about informed consent from a legal point of view? Well, it really means that the person needs to be aware of the consequences of giving their consent, and in fact, the consequences of not giving it as well. And of course, that really means they need to know how their personal information is being handled. Now, I think it is worth saying that a lot of edtech companies and even schools will seek consent from usually parents before collecting any information or using any personal information about students. That's not necessarily because it's always required by law. In the case of edtech companies, some of them are, as you said earlier, are overseas companies. So it might be a requirement in the jurisdiction in which they're registered that they need parental consent. And sometimes schools get parental consent as a default because the policies of the overarching school authority, Department of Education, might require it. In short, people do need to be notified when information is collected and how it's used. Consent is required in some cases. And as you mentioned in the introduction, how people are informed about that, how notice is given to them and how consent is got from them, it usually occurs through the legal documents, the terms and conditions, privacy policies, which, as you said, are very difficult for people to engage with. So I guess that means there's a strong argument that consent in that case isn't always informed, and even that the notices people are given are not necessarily properly given or fair. So how do we change that? The million-dollar question, but of course, I guess one way is by having more transparency and having clearer policies. But I think schools and education authorities also have a role to play in really critically analysing the legal documents and maybe even vetting some of the providers where the data practices are questionable or even where we can't actually ascertain what they are.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I think I'm going to move on to Simon because it's a really nice segue. Simon has recently completed some work looking at the terms and conditions of EdTech products that parents might be asked to read and consent to. And of course, I take your point, and I think schools and departments of education can play a really powerful role here in doing some vetting. But I'm just interested in what you found, Simon, in your recent investigation.
Yeah, so I guess I'd start out by saying I came to the story through my experiences as a parent of two primary school age children, and through my own experiences going through the consent process and my overwhelming feeling that it was an unfair thing to ask parents to do. And I'll explain a little bit why I think that is. I think it's so onerous that nobody could reasonably be expected to fulfill it, quite honestly, and we all know this, right? We all click through the terms and conditions. It's such a common thing that there's like reams and reams of memes about it on the internet. It's just a thing that is commonly accepted. And you know, during the investigation and talking to lots of people, I found that schools have vastly different levels of use of these services. And I think my children's school is probably in kind of the upper end of the engagement with digital technology. At the beginning of every year, actually, it was every 3 years, but they've changed it. Now seems to appear at the beginning of every year we get a form to fill out, and it has 20. It was 22 this year for my daughter, who's in grade 6. Different third-party products listed that they are asking parental permission or consent to use in the classrooms, and consequently, that form also asks us to read the terms and conditions and the privacy policy for all of those services. I hear laughter in the room, and yeah, it's hard to say it with a straight face, but the form does. It says that with a straight face. And, you know, while writing the story, fishing around for an appropriate kind of analogy with, you know, dense text, it came to light that the length of Moby Dick is about the same, 200,000 words of dense, not fiction, but legalese that the school was asking us to read as parents. And I just thought, like, it's ridiculous. Like, what purpose is this serving? We're busy. We're always making decisions about what our children should and shouldn't have access to, and this isn't helping the situation. And in fact, during my interviews, like I interviewed quite a few experts on the topic, and one expert I interviewed I remember really vividly because they were, you know, a legal academic in the space and had children at school and studying ed tech and the legal kind of crossover there. And I said at the end of the interview, I said, well, you know, have you read these documents for your children? And they said no. And I just thought, well, that says it all, doesn't it? Like, if the person most qualified to do this isn't doing it, but probably because they don't feel like they're going to get value out of that process, then why are we being asked to do it at all? So needless to say, I still think it's an unreasonable thing to ask parents to do, but having gone through the reporting process, I definitely have a much more nuanced view now than I did at the start about both why it's unreasonable and where the burdens fall in this process. One of the big takeaways for me, I think, was that schools and teachers and parents are all put in a really tricky position by the kind of structures that are in place at the moment. And are asked to make these really tricky decisions. You know, we all of those groups of people go into this process with the best of intentions, intending to make good decisions about what children can use and why, but really, it's just an undoable task. And you know, I think there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. You know, very few of us are experts, and I think it's an incredibly complex area, and certainly it seems like a bad idea to try and make teachers or even possibly school administrators into experts that are good enough to make those decisions. You know.
Can I just ask a question? Prior to writing the article, was there a conversation amongst parents at the school around this being a ridiculous proposition?
Yeah, there was. I don't know how broad it was, and to be fair, it may have been initiated by me. Yeah, I've been interested in digital privacy for a long time. It's not the first story I've written around that space, and so yeah, it was an interest, and so I raised the question with my parent peers. And lots of people basically held the same position as me, that it was unreasonable. Certainly nobody was reading them. Some people, like I have done on and off, had withheld consent, and some people had clicked through it and this is just how school works. And both of those positions, to be clear, I think are really valid positions to take as a parent. But for parents who take it seriously and really want to engage with that process, they're lost. Like it's just an impossible task.
Yeah, but there's a real power in sharing that experience, I think, and it's the case for many digital phenomena. We experience it on our own, and we tend to feel like we're the only one that's thought of these issues, but it's not until you speak to others and realise that that's actually a common experience. So, well, thanks, Simon. We might move on to Duane, and I'm interested in your position as a CIO at Schoolbox. How are terms and conditions agreements formatted or dealt with at the company, and is your approach typical of other edtech companies?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting hearing the different viewpoints and the thoughts around what do terms look like, what are terms that are agreed upon by a parent or by a school, and sort of what sits there. And I think it's important, and we talk about the size of the edtech industry. We're talking in Australia, it's 4.5 billion. There's about 700 edtech companies in Australia alone. We expand that out globally, and I think it goes to about $400 billion, or it's not an insignificant. But I think when you actually start to break that down, there's a question around how many of them are being are contracts or sold between that vendor and a school versus in where an agreement is formed between that vendor and the end user. And there's a really interesting world there around the terms and the structures of what sits behind it. GDPR there, many, many years ago, established this concept of the data controller, the data processor, sub-processor agreements. And one of the things that we looked at from our perspective in drafting our terms is actually supporting the school as being the data controller, providing them the mechanisms so they own that data, they own the structures, they're the ones that are able to control how that information is used. And so our agreement is with the school and informing and providing those mechanisms for the school to be able to manage that information. That information is things that are typically extracted from other systems or other processes that a school might be operating. I know we had that day a couple of months ago, and one of the questions, in this context, we look at the idea of informed consent when it comes to digital technologies, but we could probably extend that to, do we look at consent in the context of schools more generally, about are they aware of that information, where it starts and where it builds, and then how that flows through the systems. And leading into this conversation, because I knew that there was a journalist on the panel, I wanted to double check, what our terms and conditions look like and what sat there, just to make sure there was no giant gotchas. And what I actually started to look at in our privacy policy and our terms is, when we look at the idea of data collection, when we look at the idea of the privacy policy, there's two key audiences that we think about and consider. One are the teachers or the administrators, the people that we have the legal agreement with, and the other being the students and the parents. And one of the things that we do when we look at that student and parent data, we don't use that for any other purpose other than the provision of the service. So what sits there? We use it for analytics that are anonymized across our entire fleet to go, is a feature working or not? Where there is an extension to anything that might exist from a marketing perspective, that ties to how we might be able to target communication to, Koren or someone else in the school to provide that information and understanding. Now, the challenge is that from a legal perspective, there isn't necessarily an easy way of declaring all of those variations of data and everything that might possibly fall between. And this is where the grey and the blurred and all of those things become a challenge. But what I would say in the context here in Australia especially is most of the edtech vendors that schools are licensing with are that B2B or that direct relationship between the school and the vendor. And there are data processing agreements that exist. There are conversations about what you're using where. You mentioned ST4S, which was an industry attempt to standardize what we do and use for data. But when we look at a lot of the risk and the concerns and where these, bigger questions come from, they're typically not vendors that are, that have come from Australia. They might be technology companies that have translated into education technology. And so, a EULA, which has existed for 20 years that no one's ever going to read, is there for an end user because that's who they're trying to protect themselves from.
Yep.
So when we look at that sort of approach, if we look at a lot of the times that consent pops up, it's a platform that a teacher has decided to use in the context of their classroom, not a platform that a school has decided to use. And as a result, the protections and the structures are very, very different. The liabilities and the policies that are in place become very, very different. So it's a massively complex environment, but it's really dependent on the type of technologies as to the forms of agreement that exist behind them.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult for schools to get that balance right between enabling teachers and professionals to have that choice in the products they use, yet also protecting them and the students that will potentially sign up to the platform. So, Koren, I'm just wondering whether you can give us a sense of the competing interests that schools must balance when it comes to procuring and using ed tech.
Yeah, absolutely. Schools are amazing ecosystems, and when you start looking at it, there are so many different forms of ed tech used. Looking at my school, we've got cashless transactions on student cards, so that's a form of ed tech because it goes back to an app that a parent can load money onto. You've got library catalogue services that will monitor student borrowing and reading habits, but then that's connected to ebook platforms. So you've then got that avenue, which is kind of an add-on to the original service. You've got data analytics software, which is looking at the visualisation of student academic data to track cohorts and individuals or open up particular pathways for students. Then you've got the software applications used in the pursuit of current practices of teaching. So here you might have curriculum programs that are offered by third parties. So your digital textbooks that offer an interactive component. Third-party wellbeing programs that you mentioned, Lucy, delivered through digital means on everything from consent to digital citizenship. And they're just trying to teach or provide a way of teaching mandated Australian or state curriculum skills and content that's required. And in this area of teacher shortages, that's quite vital. Then you've got the skills that we want to teach students. So it might be artistic design in how to create something, and then those creations are going into a cloud, which frees up valuable storage for space on our computer hardware to keep the costs down of the actual computer purchase. But then there's the offshoot that you're then loading that, something that you've created and made into another format. We've then got software applications that provide a gamified experience, and this is really important for the wow factor. And you might go, well, why do we need a wow factor in the classroom? Because it speaks to engagement of our students. And we know when we're working with our students that we're competing for their attention span and keeping them interested in what we're trying to teach them and educate them about. Then we've got platforms that just work in the facilitation of day-to-day school operations. So displaying daily notices, timetables, attendance, a level of communication with parents. We've got a bigger area of wellbeing data that we can use. So when we might want to check in with students, tech can be a really good way of getting an emotional gauge on where our students are in the classroom, particularly when you're dealing with, it might be 150 students in a day. How can you do that in an accessible way that doesn't consume your teaching and learning time, but still provides some individualised support? But then you've got a duty of care implication. So you're asking for that data on an EdTech platform, but you've also got the duty of care of how you're going to follow that up. You've got software that administers surveys to collect information on the teaching process. So this time we're actually asking students how they're finding the learning journey, and asking them to actually kind of critique or provide information to the teacher so that they can set some goals and work on a continuous improvement of their teaching practice. And then you've got students accessing school-leased devices outside of hours. And what are they going to in their own time at home, but it's on a device that's been provided by a school. So there's a huge plethora of, I guess, competing interests there and ways that's used. And on a practical level, when you look at the number of software applications being used, how are you going to manage some students with permissions when others don't, and you're trying to teach concepts and you've only got a 50-minute block for that particular subject at that time? You're trying to teach across different age groups. There's a very different sort of set of needs that we often give to the under 13-year-olds, and then your 13 to 18-year-olds. And then when you're looking at VCE classes, you've got students there that are 18. So, where does all of that sit? You've got updates to terms and conditions that we're not in control of. So we might vet a certain number of programs, but how do you realistically build that into your schedule of going back and checking when it was last updated? Because we're not in control of that, the companies are. Do they tell us with enough notice so that we can roll that out? The length of documents to read. We don't have a legal department to analyse them. We're teachers. We're experts in teaching and learning, not reading legal documents. We need to be innovative. Now, that's something that's always at the cutting edge. We're trying to teach our students how to survive in this digital economy. We want to teach them these skills, but how do we do that if we take the tech away? Then we've got the number of individual teachers. So just at a school alone, you start looking at the number of moving parts there and the number of individuals that are at play, and that they have a certain level of autonomy, which you want to a degree because they're an expert in their subject or in their field and in teaching an age group, and they bring that expertise with them. They know what their students will engage with often. You've got school-owned devices. Then you've got web-based applications rather than programs that sit on your computer. So no longer can you just, put in your Office suite and away you go and you've got that for 3 years. Now you're signing up to a subscription, and that can change on a dime. And then you've got single sign-on that gives the illusion across a number of different platforms that there's an affiliation there. So hang on, if they're showing this single sign-on with Google or Microsoft or Apple, gee, it must be okay. There must be sort of some level that either their institution firewall or the organisation firewall will act, or it's allowing it. So there's a lot of competing interests there.
Yeah, and you've just done a wonderful job at painting just how complex the picture is in a school. And we've really sort of thought about this in terms of, the EdTech company and their relationship with the school or potentially the student or the family. But there's also informed consent when we're thinking about young people and their sharing of data with their parents, for example, or, and particularly when it's in the wellbeing space. This is another kind of layer to this issue that we probably won't get time to touch on tonight, but I think, the way we think about young people and their role in being able to make decisions around what happens to their data is something that we haven't really begun to kind of think about in this way. And the other thing that you touched on there, the trust that school or the families have in both the school and perhaps big tech as well. That's something that's certainly come up in my research, is more inclination to trust big tech because we're familiar with Google, we're familiar with Apple and Microsoft, and so it just tends to be seen as less problematic. But just this week we can see that is not the case, and we need to be on guard with that.
And I think that's one of the really interesting things when you look back through the report of all the applications and where that data was leaking to ad tech agencies. And when you look at those big tech companies, and we see it with government agencies signing the agreements with these big tech companies, they've probably got the most obfuscated contracts and terms, and they're probably the ones to not trust that sits there, because they have hundreds of people designed to make you agree to something that you probably didn't want to in the first place. And it's looking at we were talking about that Microsoft example, as that's sort of been unpacked within the IT forums at the moment. that one was in regards to that everyone just had built this behaviour accepting the little pop-up that sat there.
Unquestioned.
And then, you know, the pop-up changed one day and they just accepted it. They didn't really think much about it.
Yep.
And they've now, you know, a lot of that student data is now sitting in that Microsoft world, and who knows what and how that gets used.
Yeah. So a study from the OAIC from a few years ago told us that most parents would not consent to their child being tracked and monitored for commercial purposes by any company, let alone one that is being used at school. So as a parent, Simon, can you tell us what your thoughts are about this? And in your work as a journalist, I guess what prompted you to investigate this topic?
Yeah, it's a really interesting report, and if you're interested in the space, I highly recommend reading it. I'd say my thoughts as a parent more or less concur with the majority of the parents who were surveyed. Definitely, you know, surveillance capitalism, which is the model, you know, that most big tech companies sort of operate under, where data about us is tracked and traded, and it's entrenched in the modern internet, really. I think there's a lot of privacy risks that are kind of embedded in that model, and we're just so used to accepting, or maybe we're resigned to accepting that's also going to apply to our children, and that worries me. I think you know, the finding that surprised me a little bit, I have to say, is that it was about 50% of parents that said they felt they were in control of the data, of their children's data. You can look at it the other way. 50% said they felt like they weren't in control, but I was really surprised that 50% felt like they were, because, you know, I consider myself like on the very high end of literacy in this kind of digital space. And I feel like it's absolutely out of my control. So I'd actually really love to talk to some of those parents and say, what gives you that sense of control? Because I certainly don't feel it. And yeah, so I guess what prompted me to investigate it is first of all, just a general interest in digital privacy. And I think it's a really tricky space. And you know, it's a tricky space to regulate as well. You know, I think I certainly don't envy the people who are writing the new children's code, and and I hope they do a good job. But there's so many unintended consequences from things that are hard to see ahead of time.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just a fascinating thing to get your head into.
Yeah, it is. It's going to be a big job for those writing the code. And we might actually, I'll move to Duane, and I'm wondering about tracking and monitoring. Why tracking and monitoring of children is so prevalent in this market? I mean, it feels wrong. It is wrong. But why has this become the default business model of many edtech companies?
I think it's a really interesting question, and if you look at what's or why of data is being tracked, there's a number of reasons that sit behind it. So one is you've got a lot of platforms that are looking at how to develop and guide students through a learning journey. So if you look at it from that educational lens, they're trying to identify where a student's at, where do they need to go next. So to do that, you have to understand a lot about who a student is, and in some contexts that expands into sensitive data like individual learning plans and learning behaviours and things that you start to blur a line as to what's there to support the educational practice or where that goes. You've got things that were mentioned around wellbeing, which again were tied to, or where EdTech came from there was tried to look at mechanisms for early intervention and early identification, where off the back of, or through COVID and off the back of it, the amount of time that a teacher could have to move about the room and understand. And so those tools came from, I want to track how a student is going to be able to hopefully intervene earlier in that cycle. And so there's sort of those mechanisms that are tied to this concept of supporting the educator in the classroom, supporting the student, but by going down those paths, you start to increase the amount of information you capture and the amount of information you process. So you start to increase those risks. But then you look at, the world of tech vendors that do it for, if you're getting a piece of software for free, or if you're getting a piece of software for really, really cheap, you have to ask the question as to how.
Yeah.
And this is where they might be using that data to, we were having a chat before around research purposes. A number of big tech vendors, they turn around and say that they will use that data for research purposes. They will on-sell that information to universities and external organisations. You've got that world of, it was mentioned around textbook providers, and the platform might be free, but the partnership with the book providers might be there to leverage and sell you the next book or the next piece of technology that sits behind it. So the business model is fundamentally, in some instances, is tied to actually what the expectations and the requirements coming from schools are.
Yeah.
But in the other one, it's business. Like, they're going, well, I'm not making money here. How do I make money here? And so you've actually got two very, very different reasons why data tracking and data capture starts to come about.
Yeah, which makes it very difficult, obviously, for schools and departments to determine which one it is that the company's engaged in. And I think probably education is particularly vulnerable because it's sort of, for a long time, this idea of personalisation has been held up as being a real, good way to teach and learn. You know your students, and so that personalisation obviously then extends over into data collection about the individual. So, actually, I'm going to move on to Anna, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the Children's Online Privacy Code and how this might potentially change things.
Thanks, Lucy. Yes, so I guess for all of the reasons we've talked about, there's increasing consensus that the notice and consent model that really underpins our privacy laws now isn't working. It's not protecting people's privacy in general, and it's certainly not doing enough to protect children's privacy. So that really prompted a recent review of Australian privacy laws, and the government, as a result of that, made a whole load of recommendations, but one of them was the introduction of a children's code that would apply to online services likely to be accessed by children. So that would, of course, include EdTech. So, and the idea behind the code really is that instead of the onus being on the individual to try and understand impossibly and consent, that the onus is on the provider and the developer to actually really design in privacy and design in better protection for children and their data without obviously excluding them altogether. So last year there was a law passed that required the development of the Children's Code, and the responsibility for developing the code sits with the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. And so they are, as you sort of alluded to, Simon, they're currently consulting on the draft Children's Code, but we don't yet have a draft, so we don't know exactly what it's going to be, what's going to be in it. We just know it will be in place by the end of next year. But there are a few children's codes elsewhere that we can look to, and there's lots of talk about how the Australian Children's Code is likely to be modelled on the UK code and possibly the Irish fundamentals as well. So I think as a minimum, we can probably expect to see a requirement to consider the best interests of the child as a primary consideration anyway when designing services, not to use data in ways that's known to be detrimental, which ties in with the whole algorithmic decision making, of course. Greater clarity in terms of privacy policies, possibly even sort of age-appropriate language used for sort of some of the privacy notices. A requirement that privacy settings are set high by default. Possibly restrictions on who data can be shared with and for what purposes. And I think most relevantly, perhaps for the things we've been talking about today, is maybe some restrictions on profiling unless it's demonstrably in a child's best interest, but also possibly even prohibitions on tracking, at least for commercial and potentially some other purposes as well. So depending on what it looks like, I think in theory we could see that it brings in some changes. I hope so. the UK's had their children's code for a few years, and their information commissioner that regulates it has said that they're starting to see some changes in practice on the part of providers. And one of the other consequences has been greater awareness amongst parents, but also children themselves. So that's a good thing. Of course, though, for anything like this to have meaningful impact, it has to be enforced. And one of the challenges is what we've been talking about, big tech. And so, what's the the payoff for them? Is it even worth the risk of defaulting? And maybe. And then I think the other issue is someone mentioned unintended consequences, and I mean I think that's the problem in this space. Are we going to see some unintended consequences? Are we going to see those free services not able to exist, and therefore big tech rising even greater? I don't know, but so yeah. In short, hopefully some positive changes.
Yeah, that is the worry, I guess, because they have the resources to be compliant, to reassure, etc. So, watch this space, I guess. Koren, I'm interested in how cognizant teachers are about some of these issues and some of the laws that we have in place. Like you mentioned before, there's 100 teachers or so and various digital literacies, I imagine, across that. Can you give us a sense of what teachers know and think about this kind of area?
Yeah, certainly. I'd say there's definitely a broad awareness, and it's kind of similar to the moral understanding of what's right and wrong.
Yeah. So
like we go about now, so day-to-day societal life, we have that broad understanding, and that's what comes to the classroom. When it gets to that nuanced, in-depth understanding, I think there's a little bit lacking there for the individual teacher. And just like we do, I mean, we all accept terms and conditions just by clicking I agree and move on. I think there's a little bit of that because the desire to use the product can outweigh the possible risks, and that spills over into the classroom a bit too. When you do sign up for something on behalf of someone else, there is that kind of natural pause though, where you deliberate and think, well, what could the consequences be? And I know as a parent, I think differently about how I let my children use something than to if I was using it myself. And again, it's similar if you're teaching with different age groups. There's that different level of awareness. So much younger teachers, there's less of a need perhaps to engage with technology platforms. And when they do, it's quite deliberate, so they can spend more time looking at it. So they would have and more of a level of understanding on their needs. And then as you move up, you get the current debate like that we've had with social media, where we're looking at, the whole use of 16 and considering that we need to ban social media to the age of 16. That's been trickling down into the classroom too. So now we're sort of starting to see that 13, 16-year age gap as a separate entity from 16 to 18. But it's not in full swing yet. And I think that's very much speaks to society at the moment. There's that need to balance the curriculum, building skills for productive citizens of our future. That's what we want. The desire to be innovative, current, engaging for our youth, communicate with the parents in a relatable way. And I think that's another one of the areas in that duty of care. And that all creates a competition for your time. So as a classroom teacher, when you're about to go in, you're thinking of all of those different things and what you need to get through to get that 50-minute lesson up and running. So sometimes I think that competition of time, you get a bit of a lack of due diligence. So there might be that broader awareness, but there's probably that little bit lack of due diligence, especially when you're thinking about, how's the data being collected? Where's it being stored? How will it be used? That sort of falls down your list. And you might look at the bells and whistles of the new tool, and you might have been to a PD, and you've seen something great, and you think, great, this is going to solve my engagement problem tomorrow, and there's my idea for tomorrow's lesson. And it's about that immediate need. So you're not necessarily stopping to make all of those decisions, although you probably should. And then there's the assumption about the products that you're already using, that they've already been vetted and that they're okay, when in fact you might have just walked past a classroom and somebody was using something off their own bat and it hasn't been vetted at all. So, and then I think what we're really seeing at the moment is just the rapid pace of tech development. And that's where the biggest impact, I feel, is coming from. And that's really hampering a teacher's ability to be cognizant of the laws, because it's hard enough to keep up with, and I'm thinking more of AI in this space, generative AI. It's hard enough to keep up to pace with what that is and how you can use it, let alone, you know, thinking about, well, what are all the implications of that? And it's even caught some of the big companies off guard. You know, one of the main players was, you know, selling, you know, use AI, sign up to our service, get your students to sign in, you know, we're protected. And then suddenly they realised that actually, no, there weren't the safeguards, especially around things like a child's language development. You know, they're using not the sophisticated language of an 18-plus-year-old. And so you're now saying, oh no, for 13 to 18, yes, we want to upskill you in how to use AI because that is the job of the future, except that their language is not there yet. And so they're using unsophisticated language to interact with this, but there's not the safeguards in AI built around it. So this company actually pulled their product, and it's kind of left this space of there's nothing there. But teachers have still got this competing demand of we need to teach it, what are we doing? Our students are using it all the time. So how do you then meet that? So yes, there's a cognizance, but yeah, there's a lot of competing priorities there.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I can only imagine. So we might turn now to questions from the audience, and we'll start with the, questions from people here, but we might also have some questions online. So if you just pop your hand up, and we've got some roving mics, we'll get one over to you if you have a question.
Thank you. I'll get the ball rolling. Simon, I'm really curious. I've got a child in grade 3, and I've been a teacher for 20 years in digital space. Why on earth is the school asking you for consent when they should be loco parentis making those decisions on your behalf with your child's best interest? And out of those 22 applications, were any of them collecting sensitive information, or is it just every app that they were going to use with your child?
Two very good questions. I think to answer the first one, my feeling is that the schools or the education systems should be taking responsibility, as you suggest, in kind of vetting them. This story that I did actually has been a bit of a slow burn for me. So I've been thinking about and kind of reporting on and off for 2 or 3 years on this and talking to people about it. And the process has actually changed quite a lot in that period of time. You mentioned, Luci, SD4S early in the night. And one of the things I would say is lots of people told me that was a great development and gives schools and education departments more usable information to help make that decision on behalf of parents. And I believe that. You know, I spoke to people at the company, and I've looked at the very detailed process that they go through. But one thing that was really frustrating in the reporting of that part is that they don't provide any of that information publicly. So they're asking us to have to make these decisions as parents, but they've got all this information behind the scenes that would be really useful for us to help us make those decisions, but they don't make it available. So yes, I think they should be making those decisions themselves and standing behind them, but the way the system works right now makes that impossible, I think, for a bunch of reasons. A lot of the legislation, especially, well, I know in Queensland, basically says you have to get parental consent. And so what form that consent takes, I guess, is up to the lawyers, but it's in the legislation, so they have to ask. And the other question about why they're asking for so many is also a really good one. I actually emailed both of my kids' teachers last week, a couple of weeks ago, and asked them, which ones do you actually use in the classroom? And I'll consent to those maybe. And my son, who's in grade 2, the teacher got back to me and said 2 out of the 20 she uses in her classroom. And this comes down to like, how detailed do you want to get, right? Like it's an administrative burden for each class to send out a different consent form, and one of the biggest problems I had with the consent form is that it asks for the school's asks for permission to put in a whole bunch of information: full name, date of birth, school classroom, teacher, school name, all these things, gender, into any of them. And having spoken to a bunch of people, I now know that lots of teachers in their practice don't actually use any of that data when they're interacting with these programs, but that's not what the permission form was asking for. It was asking for this broad kind of ask covering, I guess, but yeah, it could be a lot easier.
But I think each state and territory has its own kind of method of doing this. So Anna, you might be able to speak a little bit to this, because in WA it's different again, isn't it?
In WA, in fact, in WA we've only just got state-based privacy laws that apply to the public sector, but it's long been the policy of the Department of Education, at least. So when we're talking about the government schools, the Department of Education requires that the schools get consent. They have very little autonomy, actually, in order to use third-party digital products. The schools have to get parental consent. Although, you know, there is a piece where the department says that it's vetted them. But they still have to get parental consent. So it's a bit. I think it's a bit of a tick. You know, it's a tick box, isn't it? It's a tick box compliance.
And who does that vetting is really interesting as well, right? Because I mean, in Queensland, so I inquired with the Queensland Education Department for the story, and they said, "Oh, all our stuff goes through SD4S." And I was like, "Really?" So I sent a follow up, and they said, "Oh, well, not all of it." But you know, it's up to the principal then to make that decision. And I was like, and they said, you know, like they had a whole bunch of like buzzwords about how important that process was. I was like, okay, can you show me like the guidelines? Like, not all principals are experts in privacy law, so what are the guidelines they follow? And you know, it's sort of a joke, really.
It's certainly like Queensland, and looking at this probably. About 3-4 years ago was probably the most mature market when it actually came to evaluation. So prior to SD4S actually coming in, they had their own evaluation matrix and risk matrix on every single data point that sat there. I remember going through that process and getting evaluated for some schools we were working with, and it was a process. It's interesting as it moves into SD4S, and again, we're in the second iteration of that now. So you know, you were saying about that data being publicly available for parents and things like that. Up until this iteration, we were never allowed to tell anyone that we had SD4S compliance. It was a complete secret to anyone other than those that asked.
That just baffles me. Like, I understand that there are risks associated with a company going through that process and getting a bad outcome, and there are risks with government advertising that bad outcome. But it's baffling.
The thing about it is, you know, SD4S and what sits there is it's really about providing upfront information of where the risks sit in the context of the system. Sometimes you can't actually address why you are a high risk or a medium risk because of the data in which you use. But what you can communicate are the steps and the mitigations that you put in place. And you were talking about why do you use data. I remember the argument probably about 7 years ago with our schools when we removed address fields from our student profile, because for the life of us, we could not work out why we needed to show someone's address. But that was an argument that a lot of our schools know it has to exist. But that's about reducing that risk, and that's the key question.
Yeah, privacy by design, right?
Yeah.
Could go a lot further, I think.
Yeah, least privilege approach is the best one.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes, down the front here.
Two questions. One is, have there been any legal decisions that have addressed instances where companies have misused data? I'm thinking of the analogy with consumer law, which obviously has 150 years on this kind of area, where the kind of contracts we sign are overridden by the consumer law that we have. The second question actually is kind of, as you mentioned in your introduction, is the question of equity and what teachers do when parents refuse permission to use various apps. I know that the teachers aren't using all the apps and that thing, but there is the kind of equity where they're not allowed to go on an excursion or they're not allowed to do something. How do you deal with that in a practical way in schools?
Anna, maybe do you want to take the first one, and then
Sure.
I might get Koren to ask.
So there are plenty of decisions where organisations or even government agencies have been found to have breached the privacy principles. I guess, though, the problem is what we've sort of been saying today is that they don't really go far enough. So sometimes, or very often, what's happening is that they're actually technically complying with the law, but nevertheless the practices are still detrimental and not in the child's best interest. So I think that's really sort of the biggest issue from a legal point of view. But I think you made a really, I like the analogy to consumer law, because I do think there is quite a lot of space here to challenge some of these terms and conditions and policies from a consumer point of view, and to actually argue that they are unfair and potentially even misleading. So I think it's a good point.
Yeah, and around the equity of learning, it becomes quite an issue. As a teacher, you then have to balance how many students it's going to affect. Is there an easy alternative in an activity that you can provide? What was it that you were hoping to, garner with that particular EdTech product? So if it was the wow factor, maybe you need to reconsider and find an alternative method of teaching your content area or skill. And it might be that you rethink it for the whole class in that case, so that the students aren't ever aware that there was that option to use a digital means. You might go completely offline, back to pen and paper.
And just to extend, I do know of some schools in which, if it's a core system in a particular subject, the communication from the school is, this is how we do things. We will not adapt to that particular thing. Here are a list of schools. And so there are cases where, an equity of access and all those kind of pieces where actually it's fundamental to the philosophy or the educational practice of the school. So they just put that option on the table as well. And I've known that to happen, a fair bit with some tech platforms in schools.
And it's been, can I just say, it's been really interesting with AI around equity of access. That's been one of the big things that schools must consider when they're approaching AI. And so if you're using or promoting products that require a sign-up fee, are you really promoting equity of access? So that has really need to be rethought in terms of AI and how you're approaching the teaching of that in schools.
And just very quickly, I know you've worked at a number of schools, so not just talking about the current school you're at, but what support is there for a teacher should they choose to, or they're sort of told maybe that's not the best product? What is the process that happens? Is it the IT department, or can you give us a sense of how that would actually play out in practice?
Yeah, it can really depend. At say, government primary schools, you might only get IT support for 7 hours a week.
Yeah.
So that becomes really problematic, and they're more trying to keep your IT infrastructure up and running in the classrooms, let alone, worrying about this other landscape that exists.
Yeah.
So usually it can fall to the position of a leading teacher to try and investigate, and they're not necessarily upskilled in this whole area.
Yeah.
It's someone that might have a passion for it, and then their knowledge is based on their interest in it.
Yeah.
And then that might, kind of comes back of how cognizant are they of the law? How much of an interest have they had in that side of it?
I really think that resourcing of in-house technical expertise, or under-resourcing, I should say, is a real problem. This is a part I didn't really get to dig into when I was doing the research, but I've heard that my children's school, so it's a very big school, there's about 1,400 kids in the school, and they have one full-time IT person, and 2 grades that all have BYOD iPads. So how that person is managing, I have no idea.
And it's also that balance of the IT, like, you know, and you said it in regards to it's the IT or the technical resourcing, but it's also then that educational translation of that resourcing as to what's the educational context, what are the impacts from the child and the well-being. And, you know, an IT person might not necessarily even consider down that path. They're thinking the technical, the risk and the compliance. And then you've got that question around the legals. You know, we work with a range of different schools, and sometimes our contracts land with the top tier law firms. The other time it lands on a business manager that has just been at the school for a while, has done a little bit of work, and they're responsible for, you know, signing, you know, multi-million-dollar agreements sometimes.
Huge responsibility.
So, you do then lean on your, you know, overarching organisation, whether that's the Department of Education, whether that's a Catholic diocese for support. And you're then sort of guided by them. Because your leading teacher is really looking at how to bridge the gap of making the tech meaningful in the classroom, how to support the learning, and your technician is just trying to keep things up and running. And if you're fortunate enough to work in a school that does have an IT department, well, then you do have some expertise, and generally you might then have sort of an ICT steering committee, and that committee is made up usually of some principal class, some teachers, some of your technical support staff, and they can have roundtable discussions around it.
Great. Okay, do we have got a couple more?
Thank you. I feel a bit bad stealing the mic. Kate Bauer from the OAIC. I just want to say, as the person who is responsible for registering and developing the children's code, I am actually grateful I'm not a classroom teacher and navigating the complexity on the ground. So kudos. I have a question, probably more for Corinne, but really interested in the views of all of the panel. I think one of the things, I'm going to borrow Julian Mangrant's analogy about the 3-legged stool, that when we're thinking about digital protection for children in particular, the roles of safety, privacy and cybersecurity all come into play. And if we don't have one of those legs of the stool, it all falls off. But in my experience, privacy has kind of been like the ugly stepsister of the trio. Maybe there was 2 ugly stepsisters, maybe it's the wrong analogy, but obviously I need to go back to school for a fairy tale. But you know, there's been a very, very heavy focus and you know, needed on online safety in particular, and particularly for children. How do you think that kind of plays out in the considerations for teachers and in the balance of thinking through that is potentially data privacy the kind of last consideration when we're thinking through also that potentially this, I don't actually know the Safer Technology for Schools standard, but I'm guessing a lot of that might also be to do with cybersecurity and how vulnerable as a security those types of technologies are, and whether the panel has reflections on how we can promote the importance of privacy so that the stool is not uneven and we don't topple over.
Who would like to start?
Well, I would just say, actually, though, on that I was recently looking at the resources that the OAIC has put out around consultation on the Children's Code, and some absolutely fabulous resources for teachers for all different grade levels where you're sort of having those conversations about privacy and personal information. So, I mean, for the teachers here that may not have seen that, that's a fantastic resource and a great way of prompting those conversations, and I think in a really meaningful way, because it's actually part of the consultation that they're actually doing it for a reason. So that was great. I was impressed.
I think my work in schools, when we talk to teachers about, you know, data privacy, I think it often becomes conflated with the other two. So they just immediately switch to data security, you know, and you end up sort of having to really prompt that conversation along. So I think you're right, it probably is the ugly third sister or whatever the analogy was, but I mean my experience has been that as well. So
I think one of the things, thinking about it, you know, especially you were talking about the progression of technologies and where things are going, one of the key challenges is when you, or how do we help educators and school leaders to understand the impacts of, we really want systems to do this, but this is the data that has to be exposed. This is the information. This is the cost of what sits there. Data security, it's a given in most technology vendors now. Like, if we don't abide by that, the fines and everything just will kill a company. But we have this interesting balance where the expectations, one of the things we look at even in early education, the expectation on a parent to receive hourly or daily communication about absolutely everything. Do we actually educate people on understanding the privacy implications of, they want to know every single time the nappy with the photo of the nappy? Like, I couldn't believe that was actually a thing until I was talking to people about sending my child to daycare, and I'm like, what? So it's actually, I think it's how do we help educate people as they're thinking about, this is the reason why I want to do this thing. How do we give them the tool set to understand what data is required to drive that decision? Because, and you spoke about why are EdTech businesses capturing and tracking data. For a fair chunk of it, it's because we're getting told to by our customers, and it's the core requirement of what our schools are wanting. Not every EdTech vendor is doing it for nefarious reasons.
No.
So how we help people understand those implications, I think that's where it becomes really, really important. And I don't think we've ever really done that in education well.
Or anywhere.
Well,
I think one of the things that I had to grapple with early in my reporting on this piece was that my personal position was different to a lot of the parents that I'd been speaking to. There were plenty who had similar views to me, but there were also plenty who just clicked through it. They were like, yep, agree, and they were fine with that. And so I think that comes from a few different places. Like, first of all, I think some people just have different standards of what they think of privacy, what privacy they should have. Some people have a certain level of naivety, especially around digital privacy. I've used this analogy before, where I think in some ways digital privacy is a very climate change-like problem, where the scope of the problem can get very big before there's consensus in the community about what that it even is a problem, or what the problem is, or what we might do to address it. And I think we're already there, but we haven't gone the next step, like sort of society has, I think, now with climate change, in that we're still trying to get people to that understanding. You talk to somebody who has a bit of a knowledge and an interest in this space, and very often they're alarmed by digital privacy practices, right? But if you're talking to somebody who hasn't had that interest and hasn't dug into it a bit, they're a bit blasé about it. And I think, so naivety, education, it's a tricky thing.
And I think that's what you're seeing in your teachers at school. It's that naivety around it. And people approach it very differently. I think it's starting to become the conversation, and there's that definite need for education. So there's now policies that roll out on our platform, and every year you have to sit down and read the policy, and then I agree and answer the quizzes, and you have to score a certain percentage correct before it will let you pass. But in practice, I think we're probably starting to educate our students a little bit more than what we are our teachers. And I know just this week in my IT class in Year 8, we're teaching data privacy as part of the digital citizenship. But I don't think it's yet filtered through to the teachers.
Well, it's a generational thing too, right? And like, one of the things that struck me, I was going to use this as a bit of a closer, if I got the chance, is that there's a report that you mentioned by the Human Rights Watch, and the title of that report is something like, "How dare they peep into my private life?" And that's a direct quote from a child of 9, I think, who they'd spoken to. And when you take children through that report or things like it and the implications of companies using the data the way they've used it, they're horrified. Very often, almost always, they're horrified. And so, yeah, I think, as always, the younger generations are going to be better than us at understanding.
Yeah, and I think just to round this off, that the actual, and you touched on it, Simon, that the alternatives, like we've come to accept just things as they are, and there's not a viable alternative between, like we almost need like a choice, the choice kind of this or that, to measure up products against each other to know how they're different, because otherwise they just appear and we just end up signing up. But Polly, got time for one more question? Luke's got one, yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, and great closer. I'll leave it with that. I was thinking, so for my kids at school, I was thinking about what I have to sign consent on, right? And the two things that seem to come back are like explicit risk. We're going to camp, and like, can they eat shellfish there, right? And then the other stuff is controversies, whether it's curriculum or whatever, right? There's a controversy here, so the Queensland government says I as parent need to decide, right? So my question to each of you maybe is, what do you think it would take to move edutech away from the controversy and the risk? Right? Because right now that consent question continues to come up, and I see it, I'm presented as either controversy or risk that I'm having to consent to. What moves it away from those two values, if you will, to use in schools?
I mean, yeah, that's a hard one. I think on the risk front, it's just about education, right? It's just about people having a better overall understanding of digital privacy and risks around digital spaces, and confidence and trust in the system. Like, I genuinely think I should be able to trust the school and the education department to make those decisions on my behalf as a parent, what systems they use, and trust that they have made a good decision about its safety and all that sort of thing. But right now I can't, because I don't get the right kind of information. I won't say I don't get enough information, because the aforementioned 200,000 words, but I definitely don't get the right kind of information. The other bit around controversy, I think that's a harder question.
Yeah, I think, especially when it comes to technology, I don't think the risk piece is ever going to go away. And if we use the mechanism of, when we look at it from a data security perspective, we're in a world where we're moving towards a zero trust approach to technology, where don't trust anything is one of the best ways of protecting that data. So I don't think the risk, and especially with a lot of education technology, we're talking about sensitive information. We're not even talking about private information. We've moved into that world of sensitive, and I was talking to someone earlier about psychologist information and things like that. As a business, we actually draw a line of anything that steps into that medical or that, we don't endorse that use in our system. Because it increases that risk profile dramatically. So risk, I don't think, will ever go away. The controversy piece, I think that's more tied to commercial decisions that schools make in deciding their technology choices. And whether it's schools, whether it's government departments, it often is a business decision as to whether they're going to step into something that is more controversial or what that sort of looks like. Less so than, as I said, there's 700 edtech vendors in Australia. And I think if you were to go and review the terms and conditions, and I know one of them in the human rights report, I think was Style, that came out relatively glowing in pretty much everything that they did. Like, most of the vendors here in the industry are not out to cause controversy. But I will tell you now, most of the decisions and most of the vendors that are chosen by our government departments are not in that list of 700 vendors. So often it is a commercial decision that's leading to the controversy and the risk in that space. And that's where there's some maturity around that decision-making process and understanding those risks.
I think, okay, sorry, can I jump in very quickly? I think for around controversy, we're sort of looking at my current school around values and the school values and creating some partnerships with parents and potentially exploring, well, what are our school values when it comes to EdTech products? And then once we have some values formulated, we can then wear a hat that says, well, this is the risk profile according to our values. You're then putting it back in the hands of the parents. So if you don't agree with our values, perhaps we aren't the educational institution for you. And maybe that needs to be tackled at a higher, organisational level, whether it's the departments of education. That would be great. It saves lots of different schools trying to tackle it themselves. But that might help alleviate some of the controversy element.
There's potential for this to be like an educative community building process where the community comes together to decide what the values are and what kind of standards we want for the technology that's used in our schools. So I think that's definitely a positive way forward, at least for the schools I've been working in. It's time to wrap it up, and I'd like to thank all the panellists for their contributions tonight. And by way of concluding, I just wondered if each of you might share, just in a few words, a sentence maybe, what is the main challenge in your mind to achieving informed consent in schools? And we'll allow you one more sentence if you can provide us with the means to get over that challenge. Well, starting with you, Duane.
The means to get over it. Look, I think the biggest challenge is education. It's knowledge. I will say, working in the industry and working with top tier schools right the way down, educating people on understanding what data is being used where, the implications of a decision both now and into the future, is challenging, and we see people repeat the same mistakes over and over again. How we educate, what does that look like? That's a question I don't think we've resolved in enterprise systems and business yet, let alone how that translates into education.
Anna.
Okay, so I'm going to say something that we haven't really spoken about, but that's the question and the challenge, I think, of who consent is obtained from. Because I think the default position of schools is very often to go to the parent and only to the parent, and yet we've been talking about how often young people actually have a better understanding, or at least as good an understanding as parents in this space. So for me, I'd like to sort of think that I think one of the challenges for schools and potentially education departments as well when they're setting policies is to actually, once they've built some of this capacity, to actually put your money where your mouth is and don't go to parents, or don't just go to parents when, of course, not for all children, but a certain sort of age level and maturity. So I think it's a challenge because the way things are done is that tick box compliance of ask the parents and then we'll be okay. I think that needs to be moved away from.
Thanks. Koren.
I think the main challenge is around the rapid evolving nature of technology and just trying to keep up. And I concur here with Duane that I think educating the community, the staff, around digital rights of students, the child, is the way to go.
Simon.
I reckon the main challenge is the regulatory environment, and that's what leads to this process that parents undertake, and it's what leads to the reams and reams of legalese. I would like to see a change in the regulatory environment that prioritises, safety by default, that is maybe even quite prescriptive about the kinds of information that can be gathered and the ways it can be used, rather than just saying, well, you can get whatever you want as long as you tell people what you're doing with it, and then they tell you in these insane ways that nobody can understand. But that's, like I sort of said earlier, that's no easy task, and I think there is a flip side danger in that of unintended consequences. So, it's hard.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us here tonight and for those online. And a very special thank you to our interstate panellists, Anna and Simon. We really have learnt so much from you all. And it's been such a rich conversation. And I think, you know, the timing is great given the drafting of the online privacy code for children. But I think more importantly, it's just about raising awareness of this as an issue and really putting it on the table so we can share our experiences and perhaps really move forward to lift the standards for Australian families and students. So thanks very much. We have drinks and canapes for everyone here tonight.